I feel after Paul that I should have my wee black and white cat, you know. I've actually got 3 of them. I could have sort of made a bit of an impact there, but you know what cats are like? They're a bit like Scots. You can't herd them very easily, you know. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. Also delighted to have listened to Paul, because there's absolutely nothing left for me to say now, basically. He's been through the whole thing, except perhaps one area, and that is to kind of envision what the independent Scotland would be like. Because we have a lot of talk, and sure, it's fascinating, all the kind of in-by stuff, all the weather, all the detail of where we are, the nonsense with the Tories. You know, if there's any slip back from this unbelievable high that the SNP achieved last time, that's a vote against independence. But if they didn't get more than one whopping seat, that's nothing. So you can see all the hypocrisy, you can see the double standards. Alex Salmond in the National today is quite right. This election was very probably called to avoid the expenses scandal surrounding the Tories that would have removed 17 MPs. And yet Theresa May's pals in the so-called National, but you know, London press, there's no squeak of that as a possible explanation. It's like heresy to mention it on the telly. But that's very probably where we're here, and do you know something? This will be the only stage and place in Britain today where that heretical thought is even mentioned in the middle of an election campaign. So this is British politics. It's duplicitous, it's thin, and unfortunately the broadcasting that surrounds it is boring and thin and doesn't get into any of the issues we need to discuss. So as usual, we're going to have to roll our own and do this ourselves. So it's great that this kind of momentum has begun. But in all of this, it's still weather. Because I've been standing, as some of you may know, doing many television interviews with guys who have become like umbilical twins, like Alex Massey, for example. No, listen, he said, you know, I mean, I've got to say, I'm not a great favour of getting personally nippy with anybody. I mean, actually anybody, because that's weather as well. Alex is a fairly broad-minded guy, and actually in interviews that I've done with him, when he was asked recently if he thought Scotland would be an independent country in 10 years' time, he said yes. David Torrance, don't even start. David Torrance, on another interview with another interviewer who asked that same question, 10 years' time? Yes. So the point is, in climatic terms, in 10 years' time terms, practically everybody that I've been on with as opponents concedes that independence will probably have been achieved. So our only issue is how to get from here to there. And actually in the course of that, I think it helps to be able to hourleap the dike and see what lies ahead. Because if it's tasty, it gets you going, it makes you move forward, it makes you visualise, it uses your imagination. One of the themes of a great new play that's on at the Dundee Rep, by the way, do go along when you've got time. The issue is what we could do with an independent Scotland. And in that, some of you may know, I can bore for the universe about the Nordic countries, but it's worth doing. Let me just tell you one story that is amazing. I've recently edited a book about the different ways Scotland could be in Europe, and the Nordics have got plenty of a template. There was one speaker who's written in that book, a guy called Jon Baldvin Hannibalsson. He's from Iceland. Anyone been to Iceland? I'll tell you, the rest of you are missing yourselves. And go now, because actually you can afford a crisp packet. You know, it's the time to go. Anyway, Jon Baldvin, when in 1991, Lithuania, which was then one of the Soviet republics, declared independence. And immediately the tanks rolled in, 18 people were killed at the TV station, and the whole thing looked like it would fade away. And a wee guy got on a plane in Reykjavik, arrived in Lithuania, went into the middle of that maelstrom, and Jon Baldvin Hannibalsson, the foreign minister of Iceland, population 300,000, Dundee walked in and recognised Lithuania as an independent country. The killing stopped. Within 4 days, other countries had also recognised Lithuania, and within a month, it was a member of the United Nations. After that, Latvia and Croatia had the courage to do the same thing, and each time, the first person to recognise independence of those states was Jon Baldvin Hannibalsson from Iceland, population 300,000, Dundee. Now that's what you can do when you have smedum, purpose and control. These kind of actions are unbelievable from the size of these tiny little countries. Another country, the Faroes, has got a hugely devolved parliament. It has the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. That's the reason that mothership Denmark is in the EU, whilst the Faroes, population 40,000, Lochee, okay, Newport. Have we got Dundees or Fifers here? I think it's a Fife crowd, isn't it? Right, okay. Ixie pixie. Well, okay. Newport. 40,000 people in the Faroes got a parliament in 1946 because they dared to have a referendum on independence. 40,000 people, and the result was 50.7% yes. So with that, the Danish government, because they don't think like the Brits, one singer, one song, winner takes all, my way or the highway, that's Britain. But the Danes thought, by gum, we need to keep these guys on side or we're going to lose 200 miles of fishing. So they did what the British have failed to do. They gave the Faroes, population 40,000, the world's most powerfully devolved parliament, which included the right to sign international trade agreements. Can you believe it? Newport can sign international trade agreements. And so, when Denmark decided in 1973 to join the EU, the Faroes took one look at the common fisheries policy and went, nah, we're not having that. And there was no argument. They just opted out. Now, I don't know, I was only, well, I'm not saying at that age, right? But I wasn't really focused too much on international politics. But I didn't notice the world stopping. Difference. What is the problem with difference? You know, there can be an accommodation of that. And sure enough, that actually nipped their independence movement in the bud for quite a long time, though it's bubbling up again. So there's another wee country that we could learn something from. The Finns, on the other hand, have taken a totally different tack in Europe. And there's a reason for that. It's called Russia. If Ludovic Kennedy was quoting someone else when he said Scotland was like being in bed with an elephant, Finland is in bed with a stegosaurus, with a sore head. And it's got an issue with that because it's always worried about the territorial expansionism of President Putin. So, there is a constitutional bar on being a member of NATO in the Finnish constitution because they have to show they're not trying to wind the Russians up. So what is their foreign policy? What is their security? It's membership of the EU. That's what they believe. And they have also joined the euro, which you may notice has not noticeably collapsed yet despite all contesting claims. So that's their outlook, and their resolve is to make the EU work better for small nations. Take the Swedes. The Swedes joined the EU in 1985. They were late. Why were they late? Because they worried that the standards of the European Union were too low for them. Now, this tells you all you need to know practically about the squashed economic outlook of Scotland, because we have been keen on the EU because it brought standards up. For those of us old enough to have remembered the dreaded Margaret Thatcher, and here's my sole exception. Okay. In that period, the main opposition came from Europe. It came in the form of working time directives. It came in the form of reasonable, decent ideas about how you might run life, workplace and everything else. And I think the Scots of that age remember that. That's a large reason that there's a sort of automatically pro-EU thing going here. But the Swedes looked at those same regulations that we regarded as giving hope to us of some sort of decent working life, and they were too low for them, so they didn't join. But by 1985, they had a few economic problems. They also decided that actually it was no use getting Sweden all tickety-boo if the rest of the world was falling to pieces. They needed to be part of a bigger thing. And now, some of you might have seen a picture floating about of the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, a woman called Isabella Lövin, who was signing an executive decree with a whole stack of women behind her. She was kind of taking the mick out of that Trump picture. But what executive order was she signing? It was one that was redoubling Sweden's already pretty impressive commitment to climate change, because she says Europe is now the thought leader of the world. It must be because the Americans have just gone off onto an asteroid. They're not coming back for 5 years at least. And her commitment to Europe is as a socialist, feminist, Swedish lefty. Now that's an extraordinary thing. So when you look at that, here's two possibilities for Scotland. It can be an independent country within the EU, and it can line up with Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Scotland. There's something pretty tasty about that wee line-up, isn't there? And those four countries with a like-minded outlook and with an ability to encourage difference and encourage movement and cooperation around Northern Europe, those four countries can reform the European Union. Or we can look to our North Atlantic status, because we are also a North Atlantic nation. And we have Iceland, Norway, and the Faroes, who are not full members of the EU. They're members of the halfway house, which is the EEA. Here's how I look at it. The EEA is like the saucer to the EU cup. The EEA has the underlying stuff, that's access to the single market and the four big freedoms of movement. The EU has got things like the common fisheries policy, which is rubbish, the common agricultural policy, whose subsidies shore up the inequities of Scottish land ownership, which is in itself appallingly unfair, and favour both... Sorry, little conspiracy from the Duke of Buccleuch there. And favour the large landowner and the large fish operator. There are slipper fishermen, there are slipper farmers living in Marbella who are getting quota and subsidies from the EU without actively farming or fishing or living in Scotland. Now that has got to stop, and it could be up to us because we control these powers now. We could be doing something about it, but that system, that British way of thinking, that top-downness, the belief that big is beautiful, all of that is so embedded and shored up by subsidies and so on that it's hard to change. So you could have the saucer without the cup. That's one possibility, and that's what Iceland and Norway have done. They joined the EEA thinking they would move on to full EU membership, and then when they sort of got there, they thought, do you know something, this is okay. We can pay, we can get stuff into the single market, we've got freedom of movement, we can share academic funding, we're not obliged to the customs union, which for an independent Scotland could be important. And do you know something? At the moment, Willie Rennie, for example, in yesterday's First Minister's Questions, which if you didn't hear it is totally worth listening to because Nicola Sturgeon was on fire. There's a gal who's itching for an election, I'll tell you. She's ready to roll. But Willie Rennie, who was third up, and actually after Nicola had dismantled Ruth Davidson and Kezia Dugdale, fair play, it would be pretty scary to think of actually asking anything. But he was trying to suggest that the fact that Scotland has got two sterling, marvellous opportunities of a different route as an independent country in Europe, we have two big, tasty opportunities which Britain doesn't have, because Britain can't join the EEA. It can't, because the EEA is composed of the 28 EU members and the 3 members of EFTA. And do you think the 28 members of the EU are going to let Brexiting Britain into another club that they're partly controlling? I don't think so. But I can tell you that they are quite happy to consider the possibility of an independent Scotland in that role. So we have options that Britain doesn't. And that is portrayed by folk like Willie Rennie as a problem. Now, I know in the narrow world of politics, it's all got to be there's no ambiguity and you must just have one answer to everything. This is one of the outlooks, folks, that we must escape from, because this is the way the British do politics. There's practically nobody else looks at it that way. Power is very generally shared. You can have options and you can discuss them. So all I'm saying is, let's visualize, let's discuss them. Let's think of the different ways we could be, because in 10 years' time, we're already over that dike. We're actually in a different situation, and we only need to decide which of two very good alternatives might be at least the right way to move. And just as one last thing, when you think about the kind of gestures and actually interventions that can be made, obviously Norway is massively known about for its oil fund. But you might not know that what the Norwegians have also done, without demonstrating it to anybody else, is quietly going in and removing the nuclear cores of every lighthouse in the Russian sector of the Barents Sea for everybody, because it's safer. Now, these are the kind of interventions you can make when you think differently. And that's what lies ahead if we can visualize that. So let's think ahead. We are already almost in Europe. We are already almost independent. And we need to start now thinking over that divide, over that momentary frontier, over that obstacle that's just in front of us, to the independent Scotland we are destined to become. Thank you.